Good afternoon, class. We're going to continue on with our lesson on pollution. This specific video is going to cover, uh, as the title suggests, air pollution. And during this lesson, you guys are going to learn about what air pollution is, what's going to cause or contribute towards air pollution. You're also going to learn about climate change, global warming, and greenhouse gases. And then at the end of the video, as usual, there will be a few questions for you guys to answer, and you can email me that uh, your responses. Okay, so let's begin. Let's start off with these two pictures here. So these pictures are just showing some potential sources of air pollution. Now, two big sources of air pollution, you're gonna have, smoke that's given off from different factories, and then you also have car exhaust, or which is another, form of smoke that's going to be given off from cars. All right, so this is just two examples of air pollution. There's a lot of different examples of air pollution. Basically, wherever you'll find, you know, I guess a power plant, where all of our electricity is going to come from, that's going to give off a certain amount of exhaust fumes or smoke from the power plant. Because at a power plant, they're going to be burning, fuel, and that's how we actually going to get our energy. So wherever any process that's going to be burning some type of fuel, that's going to give off a lot of smoke as a waste product. All right, that's another example. Air pollution can also be as simple as someone spraying an aerosol can. Aerosol cans have a certain chemical inside of it called CFC, but we will learn more about that as we move along in the lesson. Okay, so those are just a few examples of different things that are going to contribute towards air pollution. Something such as a fire can also contribute towards air pollution because once again, you have smoke that's going to be given off. Okay, so when it comes to air pollution, it's going to have two main effects. One effect is that it's going to affect the environment. So that's why you have these two pictures over here that basically shows, how air pollution is going to affect the environment, or air pollution might also affect our health. Okay, so it's affecting our environment as well as affecting our body. All right, so I'll start off with how air pollution is going to affect our body. Okay, so in this picture here to the above, you're looking at something that's called smog. Smog is a combination of, the fog that you would see inside the morning, as well as smoke. All right, so this smoke is basically coming from, potential factories nearby. You can't really see it in this picture here because it's not that clear. But basically, there's a factory right here, and it's giving off smoke. And once that smoke's get into the air, it's going to combine with the fog. Now, when it comes to, uh, I guess, the negative effects of smog, one, people are going to breathe this in, and this is going to affect, our respiratory system, or it's going to affect our lungs. Okay, so smoke has a lot of different chemicals inside of it, and once that gets inside our lungs, it can cause different respiratory illnesses, such as cancer for one, and then two, if someone was asthmatic, it's basically going to uh, inter- it's basically going to irritate their lungs, and it could potentially trigger an asthmatic response, especially if they live in an area that's smoky. So you'll basically find that, they would basically have asthmatic attacks more frequently. All right, now let's talk about how air pollution is going to affect the environment. Now, when it comes to how air pollution affects the environment, it's going to come down to one thing that's called the greenhouse effect. Uh, I'll expand more, or explain more uh, about the greenhouse effect later on in the lesson. But basically, this is a combination of different gases that's going to be placed inside the atmosphere from different sources. And these gases have the ability to absorb a lot of heat. So what's going to happen is basically that it's going to change the climate in a way that it's going to make it hotter, as well as it's going to impact different ecosystems or environments. So with this picture here, this polar bear, we know polar bears are supposed to live, I guess, in the North Pole or South Pole, basically areas that are very cold, and they need ice. That's a part of their ecosystem. But if you have, the Earth or the climate of the Earth that's warming up, that's going to melt away the ice, and that's going to take away from the environment that this polar bear lives in. So that's what this picture is basically showing. It's showing a polar bear on one very small piece of ice. Now, polar bears, they usually do hunt in the water, but every now and then they need some place to rest. And because this polar bear is running out of ice, if that trend was to continue, basically it wouldn't have some place to rest or to sleep on. Okay, so to sum that up, like I said, air pollution is going to have two main effects. It's going to affect our environment, but like I said, I'm going to explain that a little bit further as we move on in the lesson. And it's also going to affect the health or our health of our bodies. And mainly it's going to be affecting our lungs, because once you breathe in this smoke has a lot of different particles and chemicals inside of it that's unhealthy for our body. They're going to irritate our lungs. It's going to increase our chance of having an asthmatic attack if a person was asthmatic. It could also contribute towards causing illnesses such as bronchitis and pneumonia as well if you continuously breathe in a poor quality of air. Okay, so now I'm going to talk more about how air pollution is going to contribute towards climate change, or basically affecting our environment. Okay, so going back to what I said about greenhouse gases. Okay, this is a concept that you guys are gonna have to, learn. And like I said, with greenhouse gases, you have a lot of different gases that are going to be released into the air. Now, these specific gases, they have the ability to absorb heat. So they have a tendency to increase the temperature of the air outside. And with an increase in temperature, that's going to cause a lot of climate change, okay? Because a high temperature is one of those things that's going to affect, what type of weather we have, okay? So with these pictures here, starting from this one right here, this picture is showing a hurricane, okay? If you have a high temperature or a lot of hot air outside, that's going to contribute towards, stronger hurricanes, okay? This is what we call climate change. All right, so let's slow it down a bit. Remember I said that the greenhouse effect was caused by placing a lot of greenhouse gases. An example of a greenhouse gas would be carbon dioxide. You also have methane. That's another example of a greenhouse gas. So these gases are being placed into the atmosphere. You're increasing their concentration, or you're increasing the amount of these greenhouse gases in the air. And once they get into the air, they are going to absorb heat. Now, because you have, a lot of heat being absorbed, that's going to affect our climate. Okay, so the greenhouse effect and climate change, they're two different things. The greenhouse effect is going to cause climate change, okay? All right, so moving on, like I said, you'll find that if you increase the temperature outside, that's going to negatively affect the weather, okay? So far I talked about how having hotter air outside or increasing the temperature of the atmosphere outside, that's going to contribute towards hurricanes. in this specific example here. Now, going back to that picture with the polar bear, remember I said, once the climate gets warmer or the air gets warmer, that's going to cause the ice to melt in the North Pole or the northern regions of the world, as well as in the South Pole. Okay, once this ice starts to melt, it's going to cause the sea levels to rise, because once ice melts, it's going to turn into water. So this is going to cause the sea levels of the entire globe to start rising. Okay, and that's why, another thing that's going to happen with climate change is that any weather related to, water is going to be more intense. So for example, with this one here, you're looking at a storm surge, okay? Or this could also be a tsunami. So basically any water related weather or natural disaster is going to be worse. So with a storm surge, the water is basically going to rise a little bit higher. The water is going to move in a little bit further inland. So this is an example of climate change affecting the weather again. You're going to have more intense storm surges or tsunamis in areas that would have tsunamis. Another thing that you find happening with climate change is that you will also have increased flooding, and for places that are already low lying. For example, in this picture here, this is a place called Venice. It's found inside Italy. Basically, people, because their water, their their land is so low lying, uh, they basically have to live around these flooding conditions. Okay, so basically they'll have these little, canals within their city, because that's how low lying their land is. It's very prone to flooding. And in fact, during most parts of the year, you're gonna find, water uh, within the city. With this bottom picture here, this is the same place. Uh, Whenever it was to rain, because they're already low lying and they already have some type of flood, for the majority of the year, whenever it's going to rain, that's going to make that flooding even worse, because now the water is basically going to be, a little bit higher. There was always water in certain areas of the city, and whenever it rains, it's just going to make that flooding even worse. Okay, so that's one of the effects of air pollution. Whenever you have a lot of, uh, I guess, certain greenhouse gases being pumped into the air, that's going to cause climate change. All right, so this right here is just summing up everything we talked about so far. The two main effects of air pollution. One, there's going to be an environmental impact. An example of that is called climate change. Okay, and with climate change, you find that the air is going to get warmer, and that's going to melt the ice caps at the North and South Poles. And once you melt the ice, that's going to cause the water or the sea levels to rise. And I also said that this can also cause extreme weather patterns. Okay, so going back to the example of the hurricane, hurricanes basically need a lot of warm air to basically make them stronger. All right, so like I said, with the greenhouse gases, they're going to warm up the atmosphere. Okay, that's also called global warming, but I'll talk about that in more detail as I carry on in the lesson. And for the second effect of air pollution, like I said, it's going to have a negative impact on our health. Okay, so any respiratory ailment or disease is going to be worsened. Okay, so for example, if someone had, an asthmatic condition, or they had asthma, and they lived in an area where there was a lot of smoke or some type of, uh, pollution, air pollution being given off by nearby factories, that is going to make their asthma worse. Another thing that can happen from breathing in all these different chemicals from the smoke, that it can also cause cancer, And it could also cause a number of different diseases, such as bronchitis, for example. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about global warming. All right, so far I already, explained what the greenhouse effect is and what's going to cause it. Okay, so an example of a greenhouse gas, the one I told you guys about so far was carbon dioxide. You also have something called sulfur dioxide, and you also have methane. So these are three examples of greenhouse gases. Remember, a gas is just basically, a form of matter that's basically air. It's a type of, I guess it's going to make up the air. You have a number of different gases. You have, oxygen, for example, that we breathe in. We have carbon dioxide. Now, with the greenhouse gases, these are gases that, once they are released into the atmosphere, they're going to cause the atmosphere to warm up. Okay, so it's the same way how, a blanket, this is a picture of a blanket, is going to, I guess, keep us warm. Once these gases get into the air, it's going to warm up the atmosphere. So it's actually going to make outside feel a little bit hotter. All right, so like I said, with this over here, this is just showing, examples of greenhouse gases. And like I said, carbon dioxide, that's a major contributor to greenhouse gases. You also have methane, you have the nitrous oxide, and then you have fluorinated gases. Okay, so these different gases, or in this case, pollutants. Remember we said a pollutant was something that's going to basically negatively affect an environment. Okay, so these pollutants are going to have different sources. Okay, the source of carbon dioxide could be, from burning fossil fuels. Whenever a fossil fuel is burned, that's going to release carbon dioxide into the air. An example of a source of methane is going to be livestock farms, because a lot of those different animals, they're going to release methane whenever they, I guess, produce some type of waste. Okay, so that methane is going to get into the atmosphere. Now with nitrous oxide, you're gonna find that being given off from different factories, and sometimes you find a little bit being released inside the exhaust from cars. Okay, so those are different sources of greenhouse gases. We call them greenhouse gases because they are going to cause the greenhouse effect. And remember I said that the greenhouse effect is basically the warming up of the atmosphere. Okay, so the same way how a comforter is going to keep us warm, once these greenhouse gases get into the air, they're going to cause the air to become warmer. Okay, we call this global warming. Okay, so that's what global warming is. Global warming is the warming of the Earth's atmosphere as a result of these greenhouse gases. Okay, and like I said before, greenhouse gases, they are going to absorb heat. So the same way how a sponge is going to absorb water, once there's a lot of greenhouse gases inside the atmosphere, it's going to absorb heat. All right, so I talked about these greenhouse gases. Now, when it comes to this thing called CFC, this is another greenhouse gas, but this gas is going to do something a little bit different. That's why I have a star right here. Basically, with CFCs, they're going to damage the ozone layer. Okay, but we'll talk about that a little bit more, as I move on in the lesson. Okay, so this picture here is just showing, how global warming is going to happen. Now, remember I said, once these gases get into the atmosphere, they're going to absorb heat. In the same way that a comforter is going to absorb heat. Okay, so with this picture here, this is basically showing the sun. You know, this a lot of our heat, well, actually all of our heat is going to come from the light that comes from the sun. Okay, so whenever the sun gives off light, that light is going to, help us to see, as well as it's going to warm up the atmosphere a little bit. Now, usually, this light comes into the atmosphere and it's going to be reflected. So some of that heat or light is also going to go back into space because we have this layer called the ozone layer, and it's going to help reflect some of that light outside. But whenever you have a lot of greenhouse gases, inside of the atmosphere, that's what these little, pictures are right here. These little circles, they are going to absorb heat. So you can kind of think of it as, a big blanket that's covering the earth, a blanket of air that's going to absorb heat. It's going to stop some of that heat from leaving the atmosphere. So because some of the heat is, being prevented from leaving the atmosphere, that's going to cause the earth to warm up. Okay, so let's look at these arrows, and let me recap what I said just now. So you have, this light, moving from the sun and into the Earth's atmosphere. This is going to provide light for us to see, and it's also going to warm up, the atmosphere. Now, like I said, the Earth atmosphere has this layer called the ozone layer that's going to help to reflect some of this radiation or this light back out into space. That's going to help to cool the planet a little bit. However, as you see, with this arrow here, because it's absorbed by heat, not all of this heat is allowed to escape. Some of that heat is still going to make it back down into the atmosphere because these greenhouse gases are going to absorb this heat. It's going to absorb the heat in the same way how, a comforter is going to trap heat, or the same way how a sponge is going to absorb water. Greenhouse gases like to absorb heat or radiation given off from the sun, and that's going to cause global warming. All right, so let's recap everything I said just now. Here's the definition of the greenhouse effect. This is the warming of the Earth's atmosphere because of an accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that traps heat. Remember earlier I said greenhouse gases, for example of that would be carbon dioxide, methane, sulfur dioxide, okay? And here's the definition for a greenhouse gas. A gas that has the ability to absorb heat and warms up the atmosphere. And like I said, here are some examples. Now, global warming, this is the warming of the Earth's atmosphere as a result of the greenhouse effect. So global warming is caused by the greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect is going to be caused by greenhouse gases. And once again, the greenhouse effect, this is the warming of the Earth's atmosphere because of the accumulation of greenhouse gases. So basically, you're increasing the amount of greenhouse gases in the air, and these gases are going to absorb the heat. And like I said earlier, global warming is going to cause climate change. Okay, so here are some examples that we already discussed with climate change. You have more severe hurricanes. You're gonna have more severe flooding. So anything related to flooding, such as a storm surge, such as a tsunami, or you also have something called flash flooding. Climate change or global warming is going to affect that. It's going to make those weather conditions more worse. It's going to make those weather conditions more intense. Okay, and another example of climate change was that in low-lying areas, they'll basically lose land to the water. Okay, so basically, because they're so prone to flooding, or because the water levels are rising, these countries are actually losing land. Okay, as you can see, they already, with this picture here, maybe 2 or 3 decades ago, people could walk in these streets. But now, because there has been so much climate change and so much raising of the sea levels, now they may have to use, boats as transportation. Same thing with this picture here. In some parts of the city, water is going to be there almost, year round. It may not be all the way up to their knees, but there's still some degree of flooding because they may live close to, a coast or someplace where there's water. And because that water level is rising, this water is going to move inland. All right, so they already have a flooding issue. The water is literally inside the city. So whenever it rains, because there was ever water, that's going to cause even more severe flooding. All right, so to sum up everything I said just now, with the negative effects of global warming, the main one is going to be climate change. All right, this is the change in the usual climate of a specific region of the Earth due to global warming. So some examples of that would be stronger hurricanes, okay? You also have increased flooding and you have stronger storm surges. Now, with this example here with longer droughts, a drought is basically when a drought is a very long period of not having rain in a specific place. So droughts tend to happen in drier countries such as Africa, for example, in certain parts of Africa. And like I said, remember with global warming, it's causing the atmosphere to be hotter. So in those dry regions inside Africa, like where they may have a desert, for example, these are places that don't have that much rain. Okay, so because global warming is going to cause it to become even more hotter, that's going to make their drought periods in certain regions more intense. Because the hotter it is, the less water vapor or water you're going to have in a given area, because all of that is going to eventually evaporate. And sometimes that water is going to move to a cooler region. So for those extremely hot regions, if they're going through a drought, that may cause that drought to be even longer. Now you might, wonder why droughts, are a bad thing. Well, basically for people who have to do farming, they're not gonna have access to any water. And also we need water on a daily basis. So droughts can be very, can be very damaging for certain areas. All right, so now let's talk about the ozone layer. All right, so what is the ozone layer? Earlier I said that, this is a protective layer inside of the Earth's atmosphere. You can think of the ozone layer as sunscreen. Okay, so the same way how people have to put on sunscreen to protect their skin from the sun, the ozone layer is a layer of a gas called ozone, and this gas has the ability to reflect some of that light or radiation back into space. So the ozone layer is basically protecting the Earth from some of this UV radiation. It's going to reflect that radiation or that light back into the atmosphere, and this is going to help regulate the temperature of the Earth. It's going to help, keep it a little bit cooler. It's basically trying to create a balance between, the amount of heat that the sun sends towards the Earth and the amount of heat that the Earth is going to reflect away from it. So that's going to have like a little balance between cooling it off and keeping it warm. Okay, so the ozone layer, once again, is a protective layer of ozone gas that's going to reflect some of this heat back into space away from the Earth. Now, when it comes to the ozone layer, uh, like I said, this is a layer where you find ozone. Ozone is a special type of gas that you naturally find inside of the atmosphere. And like I said, it's going to help reduce how much heat or radiation gets into the earth. It's basically going to help to reflect some of that radiation back into space. Now, there's a special pollutant that I talked about earlier called CFC. Remember I said this was a type of air pollution that is going to damage the ozone layer. Okay, so with this picture here, you have green. You can see, a green little color as well as orange. Where you see green and orange, that basically represents the ozone layer. At the center here, you have this big little blue dot, and this basically is showing an area where there's not much ozone left. Now with this gas CFC, it basically damages the ozone layer. It's going to create these little holes inside the ozone layer. And wherever you see these little holes, then that means that this region of the Earth is not going to have that protection from the heat or the light that's coming from the Earth. All right. You might have noticed by now that sometimes I say light, sometimes I say radiation. I'm going to continue using radiation. Radiation is just, a form of energy, light energy that comes from the sun. Okay, so because you have this hole here, now that means that, whenever the sun shows or gives off light, that light is not going to be reflected in these areas. So they can basically enter the atmosphere a lot easier. Okay, so in these regions where you see green and orange, whenever radiation comes in those areas, it's going to reflect away from the planet. It's going to help it to keep cool. But where you have areas where there is no ozone layer, then that radiation is going to go directly through the Earth. Okay, so the reason why CFC is called a greenhouse gas is because it damages the ozone layer. CFC basically is going to cause more radiation to get into the atmosphere. So it's still going to warm up the atmosphere. It's still going to cause global warming because it's causing the atmosphere to heat up quicker. The reason why that's happening is because CFC damages the ozone layer. It actually created a hole inside of the ozone layer. So this hole might be, several thousand miles, stretching across the atmosphere. So for this big, region right here, where there's no ozone, you have a lot of heat that's entering the Earth. So that's going to cause the atmosphere to warm up quicker. Okay, so that's why CFC is considered a greenhouse gas because it's still going to cause global warming. But it's a little bit different from the other gases. With carbon dioxide, you had CO2 that was basically absorbing the heat, the same way how, a blanket, is going to trap heat. But with CFC, it destroys a protective layer of the atmosphere called the ozone layer. Once you destroy that, then there's nothing there to protect the Earth. Remember I said that this ozone layer was like sunscreen. It's going to protect the Earth from radiation. But if you're destroying parts of the ozone layer, then for this specific region, radiation and heat can easily enter the atmosphere, in these regions right here. Okay, so that's going to cause the greenhouse effect. That's going to further worsen global warming. All right, so to sum up, what the ozone layer is, it's a protective outer layer of the Earth's atmosphere that reflects UV radiation from the sun back into space. This keeps the Earth cooler and at a suitable temperature. So here you have the ozone layer. It's basically a layer of ozone gas that you find inside the atmosphere, and it's going to help to reflect this UV radiation back into space. All right, so other things that's going to worsen the greenhouse effect, you have deforestation. Okay, so uh, remember, trees, they do photosynthesis. They're going to take carbon dioxide out of the air and put in oxygen. Remember, carbon dioxide was a greenhouse gas. Okay, so if you have too much of it inside of the air, it's going to cause global warming. Now, the way how deforestation is going to cause global warming is because if you cut down the trees and destroy the plants that were trying to help us by trying to remove some of that CO2, now you're not going to have anything that's going to remove the CO2. Okay, so if you were to clear down all of the forests, that's going to worsen the greenhouse effect because now we have nothing that's, trying to remove that carbon dioxide out of the air. All right, so that's how deforestation is going to contribute towards the greenhouse effect. We need trees to remove carbon dioxide. If you cut down the trees, you have nothing that's removing that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So that's going to worsen the greenhouse effect. All right, so that's it for our video. And these right here are going to be your questions. You could either, email me your responses to these questions, or you can, once again, send it to me on WhatsApp.